There are ways, for example, I was recently invited to keynote at a Benjamin conference where I tried to show that the over-visibility of something or the over-inclusion is sometimes can be seen as a mode of disavowal. Because you could say, sure, you're part of it. Sure, and that's also a way of quieting something down and forgetting. So this is very complex because you could put something front and center or purloined letter style right there, and then everyone will be blind to it and forget this searing anxiety that it carries, which brings us back to forgiving and forgetting. Let's actually jump over to that and consider a few points that Derrida will make. I'm going to start strangely later than I wanted to on page 49. Do you have that? Just to reorient ourselves. Okay, so 49, please. On the bottom of 48, Derrida will have shown that pure forgiveness, like unconditional hospitality, must not present itself as such. So it must not present itself, it's non-present. And so it can't, and he will have shown how, and I'll get back to that. It can't exhibit itself in consciousness. And this is what we're talking about. Exactly what you said. Without at the same time denying itself, betraying or, so the minute you, in consciousness, include or you forgive, that's also a betrayal. It's a disavowal. He has demonstrated how this goes, so I'm sorry to start. Or reaffirming a sovereignty, meaning I can forgive you, which devalorizes the you. Then how do we know what is an act of forgiveness if it never takes place, and who forgives whom, or what from whom? For on the other hand, and that's where I wanted to go, to the other hand, if it is necessary, as he just said, that the two sides must agree on the nature of the fault. So here's one of the problems. We've enumerated and considered a number of problems yesterday. If there is to be forgiveness, if there was ever something like pure forgiveness, even though all the doctrines, religions, and so on act as though we know what that is, and we proceed as if, and in fact, the definition of proceeding depends on forgiving. You've been forgiven, let's move on. I've been forgiven, I've forgiven myself, let's move on. So if there's not going to be forgiveness, there's not going to be moving on or history even. So Derrida at this point says we must agree on the nature of the fault. So that's already a biggie, right? A big problem. And in some therapies, they have you say what you think you understood the other did or said, and it always comes out radically disjunctive from what might have gone on or what might have been appropriated as having gone on or taken place. But so on the one hand, there needs to be a contractual, we started our encounter with contracts and a prenup and so on. We must agree on the nature of the fault. Is that going to happen? Because sometimes now comically, I'm off-ramping and sidebarring here, comically, you know, there's the childish, the infantile scene where the kid is forced to say, I'm sorry, or something, and you don't even know if he or she knows what they're sorry for. They just say, yeah, I'm sorry, or forgive me. And it may be the case that there's no agreement on what the nature of the fault is. And it's just a sheer positing or performative speech act that doesn't really interrogate itself. So must know consciously. So pure forgiveness would require a conscious knowledge of who is guilty, of which evil toward whom, and so on and so forth. And if the thing remains very improbable, the contrary is also true. We'll get back to this. Wait, I want to move on first. At the same time, it is necessary, in effect, that alterity, now this is where I was moving, alterity, non-identification, even incomprehension, remain irreducible. Forgiveness is thus mad, it must plunge, but lucidly, into the night of the unintelligible. So we've been talking a lot, that's one of our main themes and motifs today, of Unverständlichkeit, unintelligibility, the limits of intelligibility. So what Derrida seems to be saying here is that on the one hand, you think you need, that would seem like a very reasonable presupposition and precondition of forgiveness, is that, okay, what are we forgiving, what are we talking about? And what are we consciously addressing? And this is how we began today's prefatory remarks are about. Do we even know what we're celebrating or remembering or forgetting? Because there's so much unconscious intrusion and interference running into any relation to the narrative of what happened. So here, Derrida says it would necessarily have to include an experience of alterity. Does everyone know what alterity is? I need you to really... Okay. Alterity is... thank you for being honest. You don't know! Alterity is a kind of inappropriable, unrecognizable otherness. It's just difference from self, difference from other, difference from anything you would know. So you have a relation to the alterity of the other or of an event. There's something unknowable, unrecognizable, maybe inassimilable, something you certainly cannot conceptually arrest or pin down or name or identify. So that when I address your alterity, there's something infinitely big about it. It's Levinas, as we discussed earlier. It's majestic and maybe blinding, or it's abyssal. It's an abyss of the other. It's so different, you can't just reduce it to something you know or recognize. So this is a big term in French philosophy. Contemporary philosophy is alterity and your relation to alterity. Or you could say, I suppose, her alterity is so great, I have no access, I have no... But that's neither good nor bad. As you were saying earlier, there's something benign and not yet, though I will get to that, I hope, soon. So alterity is otherness in a way. But otherness that really can't be hauled in for fingerprinting or identity checks or any kind of checkpoints whereby you would then be able to say what it is or identify. Everyone, your relation to the other is a relation to alterity. It's not just a symmetrical other or an other that you can define, but it's absolute alterity, difference, something that escapes your scanners, your ability to recognize or know. So it's very important. Thank you for asking. So this is what must remain irreducible. By that, Derrida means we can't this is non-negotiable. In forgiveness, there must be alterity, like I don't know who you are or what you've done, which doesn't mean that I'm absolutely ignorant about the crime and I haven't been wounded or injured or hurt, but there's something there that exceeds or evades comprehension. So there's incomprehension, like I don't get it, I blanked out, I don't understand what happened, it's traumatic, so I can't regroup around it, or call in the tropes or the concepts to help me arrest this event into something I can comprehend, wrestle down, deal with, and understand. So there's non-identification. In other words, in any act or scene of true forgiveness, there would be a moment of, what the hell happened? I don't understand what happened. I can't identify it. It's so traumatic that I can't, that it would be already secondary revision and wrapping up and dressing the wound to say, yeah, I know what happened. I know exactly what happened. This is what happened in representational language. For forgiveness to address itself, then it needs to be on the level of, I don't get it. How could that have happened? See, it has to be all of these, let's say, humiliations in terms of knowing, understanding, being able to recognize what happened. So there's non-identification, even incomprehension, and that's why it has to, he says, it's mad, but it must plunge lucidly. In other words, there is a lucidity and a light that you are headed toward the night of the unintelligible, that something happened that exceeds intelligible limits or the limit of intelligibility. And it's not like you're just drunk out of your mind or losing it or just foobar or anything, but you know that there's something here that you cannot retrieve and contain and limit in terms of, yeah, I know what happened. Because then it's not really a trauma and it's not a question for the unforgivable. Like, it has to be somewhere near what is called the unthinkable of a terrible aggression or violence. It's so unthinkable. How could that have happened? But you understand lucidly. All you understand is that you're going into a place that you can't control or contain. And it is the unintelligible. So that would be an outer limit that I wanted to point out, but I wanted us to go. Are there any questions or remarks that you'd like to make? Anyone? Let's go to page 31 then. I think I marked that out. Wait, not 31, I think. I meant the next one, 32. Where we stopped last time, forgiveness should not be normal, normative, normalizing, remember? It should remain exceptional and extraordinary in the face of the impossible. So, as we said last time, if it were not impossible, Derrida wouldn't be going there. He's not interested. If you want to deal with the possible and things that are manageable and determinable, go to another thinker. Here, Derrida wants to, and he has the should, which means there's an injunction, there's an ethical accent. If you say, forget about it, as we say in New York, everything's cool, it's normal, now everything's normal, or we've healed, we've returned to normal, then it's not a matter of pure forgiveness. It should always remain, and this is difficult to implement, but that's why it's the impossible. If I now said it was impossible and then showed you how it was possible, that would be an unacceptable contradiction. It is impossible, but were it to be imaginable and in any way manageable, it would have to remain exceptional and extraordinary. So if forgiveness were ever to be conferred, it's not with a shrug of forget about it or all is forgiven and we're cool. No, we're not cool. We're not cool. If it's to happen, it would be on the not cool bed of tension and anxiety. Yes, John?
How does this differ from Derrida's on decision?
Right.
Because, I mean, looking at it in terms of sort of the general material practices of the courts, decisions are made all the time, although Derrida also problematizes the decision
Right.
as being impossible.
Right.
So why is this different in that, or how does the situation be?
I would suggest that and this is what's implicated here, is legality, justice, a relation to fair play if it's possible. This is what at once founds and subverts all courtroom scenarios and decision or undecidability, all scenes of decision. This is the impossibility of what we think we're doing or have understood. Now, he also doesn't want us to mesh together too quickly and too rigorously amnesty and other more legalistic satellite terms. But what he's saying here is that even if we think, and we have institutions that enact forgiveness, we have not known pure forgiveness. It may be a simulacrum, it may be a false forgiveness, it may be something that is not forgiveness, but stuffs whatever it is we think forgiveness punts for or plays for, whatever team it plays for, in a place that allows things to move on and normalize. Don't forget, he said, if there's any benefit or profit or interest, bless you, to be drawn from forgiveness, it's not forgiveness. If you feel that it's a healing, if you feel something has been settled now and we can reconcile, if you feel better, that's not forgiveness. That's therapy.
The difference would be, I would imagine, the should, the ethical that exists in forgiveness but not in the decision.
Okay, the should is
that present in the decision, the should?
Give me a sentence.
In making a decision, one comes to the undecidable, that moment where it's impossible to decide.
Right. Or that's what conditions the possibility of decision, is that it's undecidable. Correct.
Yeah, but it seems more as if it's a rational process that is the cause of that rationality can't leap over that bound. Whereas in forgiveness, it's you have the ethical component, which is not about rationality.
That's very good. That's very good. That's what we're seeing here. I think you're right. That this sudden inclusion and italicization of should is something different from Derrida's thinking about undecidability. I'd have to go back to those texts. I think you're right that there's not an ethical prompt or push toward decision, but both, you're right to indicate, have something to do with an impossible moment and a moment of plunging into madness. So you're right. So there's linkage here and difference. you're right. There's here an accent on what forgiveness should be, to be forgiveness. That's correct. So in order, if we can go, despite the impossible barricades here, if pure forgiveness were to take place, which it can't, we'll see, and we've seen, it should remain, ethically, it must remain exceptional and extraordinary. It has to be held in that tension of this can't happen. This forgiveness can blow everything up. Yes?
I think it's interesting that he switches registers, forgiveness is not, it should not.
Yes.
And there's this injunction, or this sort of
You're right.
imperative, because I mean there's an interesting relationship between imperatives and lack. That you order something because there's a kind of a lack of it, so you have to kind of prompt it to come to being. So I'm wondering if that it should not be normal, it should remain exceptional, points to the fact that it doesn't, that it enters into the world, and kind of how you deal with it in the worldness. Maybe there's a pragmatic approach, I don't know.
No, altogether very astute, that the first one is almost on the order of a commandment. Thou shalt not be normal. That's what was my commandment, by the way. It should not. You're right. There's something almost escalated to a theological imperative. It should not be normal. If it's normal to say, we're okay, don't worry about it, that's not forgiveness. Okay? It somehow, and you'll see, it has to be held in its impossible tension. Let's go on, unless anyone wants to.
Just wanted to
Yes.
take back what I said, because the text is text about the decision is about justice. So then justice would be impossible, to cross that boundary into making a just decision.
That's excellent. And at the same time, this does, of course, bleed into and mirror some of the concerns of that text. So justice is at stake as well. When you plead for forgiveness, are you outside of the realm? That's a great question, John. Are you outside of the boundaries of justice? Because forgiveness as exceptional doesn't mean, listen, on the contrary, it doesn't mean you say it's not fair for you not to forgive me. It's already an excess of justice, or outside of the maybe spaces of thinking justice, because when you ask for forgiveness, that was in New York, isn't it? When you asked for forgiveness, the question of justice may not even, but I have to think this through, it's an excellent point, may not even, it's extra-judicial, even though the judiciary counts on those kinds of decisions. Should this person be forgiven their crimes? Or how does culpability get adjudicated and so on, or not? It certainly inflects all of those issues.
But, and I can't recall if we discussed it in this piece or not, but to deny someone forgiveness also is to appoint oneself judge and to
Right.
of the other, as though you can do that.
But both. This is the double bind, and by the way, the French have loved double bind. They call it le double bind. The double bind is, even if you do forgive, it's like, who are you to forgive me, right? So either way, that's an act and trace of sovereignty. If you're in a position to deny forgiveness, or to even give or confer, should it be give the pardon, donner le pardon, or give forgiveness, you're affirming and enacting your sovereignty. Like, Who am I to forgive you? Could be one of the, or not forgive you. I'm just not in a position to do it. And yet this is what is sought. So let's move on. Here it says, the only thing that calls for, and then John would point out that this is italicized maybe, which is important. Something calls for forgiveness. So where does this is very good. Where does the urge or the question of forgiveness even arise? It's called for. There's a call that's put out, and if we could think about this longer, we would see the motif of the call. What calls for forgiveness?
Sorry, just before we go to the next, to the question of the call and what calls for forgiveness, I was hoping we could do the next paragraph, unpack it because it is extraordinarily philosophically dense. So he says, as if it interrupted the ordinary course of historical temporality. So we have this as if. Why this as if? But for me,
Right.
the decisive paragraph of this text is the next one. He says, it would be necessary to interrogate from this point of view what is called globalization, and which I elsewhere called global Latinization, to take into account the effect of Roman Christianity, which today overdetermines all language of law, of politics, and even the interpretation of what is called the, quote, return of the religious. No alleged disenchantment, no secularization comes to interpret it. Interrupted. On the contrary.
Yeah, I skipped that because this does open a whole can of worms and also addresses globalization and the way in which politics and law are still involved or generated from Roman law, Christianity, early Christianity, and so on and so forth, so that even the question of forgiveness, if it's a question, involves, and this is what he'll show, and I did skip it just to go through this for a first run and reading, how this interrupts historical temporality, as he says, but also we are still dependent to the extent that forgiveness motors all sorts of disruptions and yet legal, even quasi-foundational structures of politics and law. We're still dependent on what forgiveness might be and how it interrupts a history. Because to forgive, as in to forgive a debt, it's a cut, it's a rupture, it's an interruption of a story or a history. It means forget about it. It has meant forget it, it's over, we're done. You have been forgiven. That story's over. Let's move on. Next chapter, next problem. So, all of this pulls into question all the values that Derrida is going to consider, including nowadays what's called the return of the religious. How come everyone is suddenly religious again? And what's going on with that return? If it's a return, maybe it never went away. But something's happening on the order of an intensification of religious pathos and motivation. Everyone's going nuts on religion suddenly. What is this about? You know? In all settlements and all, it's a kind of heightening of religious fervor that was either momentarily suspended, absent, or forgotten. But there's something going on that he wants to look at, and he's motoring it through the impossible quasi-concept, para-concept of forgiveness. Yes?
Just as a sidebar, Didn't he, in sort of the French philosophy, have a sort of religious turn also? I mean,
Well, that's what you're right. He has been told that he had that turn,
yeah.
which he,
But I mean, he starts
refused.
addressing that, whereas, I mean, not that it wasn't there in the text, but it
Right.
wasn't as apparent, maybe. I don't know, I'm just trying to sort of contextualize what has been said, not that I really.
it has been said, in a sense, also to domesticate Derrida and make him, give him periodization, and
Yeah.
then say he's then had a religious turn. But as the world got more and more religiously intense and invested, he addressed that stuff, and then they said, he's getting religious, or religion. So that was a problem. It's a problem, when you work on stuff, you tend to get associated with it, which I hope doesn't happen with stupidity, for example. It's always a risk. Yes, George.
Speaking of, I just wanted to go back to that last sentence of the previous paragraph, as if it interrupted the course of historical temporality. And as I understand it, is it suggesting that forgiveness changes the course of history, of reality, as we see it? So, in the next paragraph, he's talking about global Latinization. Is that a product of previous forgiveness?
No, he's, and that's why I wish Marcus hadn't insisted on it, though I understand why he had, because we would have to read the footnote 3 and the other texts where he deals with it. Okay, so I know this is scandalous, but if we could, you're right, to ask these questions, and you articulate it well. If we could scandalously move on. Obviously, if this were a year-long seminar, I wouldn't allow for this. But he does want to show how globalization and Latinization, meaning that it's still tethered to the Roman Church. It was a kind of epidemic of everyone forgiving everyone, institutions seeking forgiveness, the Pope asking forgiveness of the Jewish people. And so he wants to show how globalization, in order to, and this is a kind of real reduction and blurb in a sense, how globalization depends on or gets driven by a whole grammar of forgiveness. And that globalizes, in a sense, which would open lots of fascinating questions on politics, and can we even talk to the other countries or the world without without being under the banner of forgiveness, or offering or taking. So it's very much part of our ability even to imagine globalization, but then he works on it very rigorously. Footnote 3. So we can go back there if you want, but here the only thing that calls for forgiveness is the worst unforgivable crime or harm. And this is where we stopped last time. Forgiveness forgives only the unforgivable. So it's where you can't or shouldn't forgive. In other words, the risk of forgiveness has to be inserted where you can't and shouldn't forgive. This is unforgivable, this crime or this harm or this this mutilation, this genocide. There's no call for forgiveness. It's so beyond measure or the bound of anything that we could even comprehend. But that's the only place where thinking forgiveness has to make sense, where sense falls apart. Otherwise, yeah, I forgive you for breaking my wine glass, sure, why not? No big deal, no deal at all, no problem. But where it's absolutely impossible, okay, where it shouldn't happen, like I will never forgive you for this, or this is the unforgivable, that's where it should happen. So it's an and it's never resolved. It's a total impossible constraint, an aporia that doesn't get simply resolved. If it were to exist, I'm not saying he's saying, yeah, let everyone off the hook, general amnesty for all. He's saying this is what pure forgiveness would entail. Are we sure we want it? Are we sure we can do it? Are we sure it's ever happened, or it could happen? Under these very rigorous philosophical strictures, more than philosophical. So that is to say that forgiveness must announce itself as impossibility itself. It can only be possible in doing the impossible. For in this century, monstrous crimes, unforgivable therefore, have not only been committed, which is perhaps itself not so new, but have become visible, known, recounted, named, archived by a so-called universal conscience, better informed than ever. So first of all, and he goes real quickly, I don't know if you know, but in certain moments with television also, and this is a technology I tried to address in an essay called Trauma TV, it was thought that the war in Vietnam was halted because the whole world was watching. There was something about if you see a crime, if it's exposed, if it becomes visible or televisible, then it will have to stop. So there we have a whole influx of guerrilla video and all sorts of witnessing apparatuses, and something that I discussed at lunch with Clara. But in a court of law in France and the United States, if you have a witness who tells something and it's full of holes and replete with false memory, and then you have a video showing what happened and it diverges significantly, not radically, what do you think the judge is going to choose as the legitimate witnessing?
The embodied receiver.
Right. It cannot be the video. Video is on the side of technology, death, and so even if the person is shown to be offering a narrative that has nothing to do with what the witnessing video or guerrilla video has shown, there's no way the judge will. As with football, at the same time as, let's say, the Rodney King trial, where video and witnessing diverged, football decided not to do instant replays, which showed that the umpires were wrong. Because that's not the precise technological reappropriation is inadmissible in court, and it's a kind of metaphysical decision. It has to be the embodied human consciousness that will witness. Yes.
In court, once the video is edited in any way, then it needs to be accompanied with the witness testimony.
Right.
So there's the perception that it's just raw, it's therefore complete, unusable, admissible, individually, which of course is not true necessarily, but it's taken as such, and then the edit then brings this other body, this other set of opinions to, interpret the edit that it's
But in terms of witnessing and legitimacy of the witnessing body or apparatus, that choice will fall on the so-called subject, and you're right to stipulate certain differences. So here I just wanted to go as far as that for now, and then move to page, I think it was 38 I had in my, which is starting on the previous page. So where he's insisting on the emphasizing the contradiction at the heart of the heritage and the necessity of maintaining the reference to an economical and unconditional forgiveness beyond the exchange and even the horizon of a redemption or reconciliation. I hope I've kind of made that clear. In other words, if there's any economy, any advantage or interest to be drawn from forgiveness, even if it's a spiritual interest or supplement or benefit, then it's not forgiveness. So it has to somehow operate according to something that belongs to the gift in forgiveness, to what gives in forgiveness, which in the giving escapes all economical determinations or limits or structures. It has to be aneconomical, right?
It has to shatter equivalence.
Yeah. And can't be measurable or accounted for. So this is also about the unaccountable. If it's to be pure forgiveness, beyond the exchange and even the horizon of redemption or reconciliation. So it's not about salvation, redemption, or reconciliation. If it's to be pure forgiveness, you don't do it because of this or that. You can't measure why you do it. You can't even know why you're doing it if it were ever to be done. If forgiveness in its purity were ever to be seen as conferable, it wouldn't be because you want salvation or affect salvation or redemption or reconciliation. Oh, come on, let's be friends, let's forgive each other. That's not forgiveness. That's because you want peace of mind, peace of heart, peace of land. I don't know what you want, but it's not forgiveness. Forgiveness should be in the absence of any calculable economical advantage. So you might say, so why do it? That would be the gift. Yes.
I was wondering about the idea of divorce in some cases where in some ways a divorce is not what it appears to be. It's an admission that you were never married in the first place, according to some theory. And in some ways maybe forgiveness is sort of similar, where you just admit that nothing happened anyway outside of that, basically that history is continuing and you're not objecting to it.
But that would be the opposite of what Derrida urges, right? Because he says that it would have to be you would have to set aside the tendency to illuminate the billboard that says forgive and forget. It's not in forgetting. It's not in erasing history. It's having it right there, re-wounding you as if for the first time. So it would bring all the pain into the space of the impossible forgiveness. If that could happen, then he says maybe that could be pure forgiveness. So it would be not allowing for suspension or forgetting of the great injury or wounding that occurred.
Right, so yeah.
So it would...
it's an emotional process, like the motion of continuing with the feeling.
It would be, it's not a process even, that's what's, it's very hard to, it would have to be a disruption, an exception, this is what I wanted to, remember I said I'm leading you to darkness as the sun is glorious. It is not forgiveness. It's impossible. Let's take that seriously. It is the impossible, your encounter with the impossible. So it's a process would be too reassuring, actually.
But also emotional. It cannot be emotional because there's always a gain or a loss. You know? So it's not even emotional.
Yeah, that's a good point, that it's hard to locate where it would be. But notice here, before we break for the day, in the middle of the page, well, not yet in the middle, still 38, then Derrida quotes the one forgiving who might say, I forgive you, if I say, I forgive you on the condition that asking forgiveness you would thus have changed and would no longer be the same. Do I forgive? What do I forgive? And whom? What and whom? Something or someone? So this is the first syntactic ambiguity. So, okay, we tried to say that, approach that yesterday, right? Do you remember this? If I address you and say I forgive you, then are you the same one as the perp who harmed me and did me wrong and injury? Or are you already someone else whom I can address? So is there a split because of temporization, because of change of scene, or tonality, or bearing, or recovery? Are you even addressing the identical being who harmed you? So there's already a self-differentiation of the other who did harm. So that would be, these are the questions that Derrida raises. Okay, so whom do I forgive and what do I forgive? I forgive that you harmed me, or I forgive that I remember something about this scene, or I forgive you because you're not the same as the one who harmed me. As you know, these are cliches that we live with, like, he's changed. He's become a good person. Well, that's bad news, because that means you can't dial up the one who was a shit and did you real harm. Could you please send me the one that was there with the knife or whatever? No, this guy has changed. He's been in rehab. He's no longer that one. That means that one has gone AWOL or is in hiding, and you can't address that one. So what are you asking of the one who has changed? Or what are you offering?
Isn't this?
Okay.
Oh, sorry. I'm just wondering. I mean, these questions about forgiveness, about justice, and their impossibility. Isn't it kind of a lead up to the transcendental? That if we had a transcendental discourse, it's like, sure, I can forgive, right? Because I can rely on this radical other, power or whatever. That this sort of, God is almost implicit in what's not stated by Derrida in this discourse, because God is this effective language that does allow decisions to take place in favor of justice, that does allow someone to think they have forgiven.
Yes, I think this is what Derrida is addressing in the passage that Marcus wanted us to focus on, and footnote 3,
Right.
and absolutely, that all of this is dependent on, but he's also playing chicken with the transcendental, to see which one swerves off the road first. This is to say, and to return to the statement that Heine, the great poet Heinrich Heine, made, that it's not even in the precincts of human doing and being to consider forgiveness. It's God's job description. I can't do it. It's not, we can't do it. We're finite, fallible beings. And if we do it, then it looks like we think we're God. Who are we to forgive?
I mean, to start with what you mentioned, there's a passage, I can't find it right away, where he says, forgiveness precisely cannot be, you cannot have recourse to some tertiary power or authority, be it God or some other juridical body that's just, been bestowed with the right to forgive. So it's in there. The point I wanted to make, or the question I wanted to ask was that of the temporization of forgiveness, or what the act of forgiveness does in relation to the temporality of the trauma or the injury. It seems to me that to an act of forgiveness which would effectively place the injury in the past as past would be something short of pure forgiveness.
Exactly, very well stated, yes.
And that forgiveness would be, in a way, to attest to the vestiges, the traces, the persistent vitality of the trauma in the present, and in a way to refuse to relinquish it into the future. Is that a fair thing to say?
It's very fair, and I see that it's going to raise all sorts of problems. Go ahead. Very nice. And again, an exemplary questioning, which is first showing the steps of what has been understood and how it's building its intervention. Go ahead.
Well, that's basically, I mean, I have, in all of our discussions of trauma, which we've had in more than one class and so on, that question continues to return.
Which question?
That of the temporality of trauma. It's, the inability to, on the one hand, locate it in the past, but yet, on the other hand, the way that one treats trauma or understands it cannot ever effectively place it in the past as something that just occurred and can be forgotten as such. It's what makes it trauma is its vitality and present.
And also its mode of kind of linking through. The way to understand, even though this will not be helpful in some ways, is the traumatic, by means of the traumatic flashback.
Yeah,
right?
That is the way I'm understanding it, which occurs in present time. Anyway, so.
Present, non-present.
Right.
Non-present, state of present.
Or the presence of an absence.
Not even an absence. It's something, a trauma is also a place of blanking out, of not being able to reconstitute, where memory is very disturbed, and yet all history depends on trauma, which is to say where memory has been riddled with holes and warpings. So trauma is a place of, if it's a place of great aporia,
Yeah.
in terms of any kind of generation of temporality. At the same time, time depends for its being on trauma because we have fallen into time as a result of a traumatic breach and violation and break. So it's a both and structure. That might be helpful to wrap our heads around this. The both and structure of the traumatic eruption that can barely be remembered and cannot be forgotten.
Yeah.
So that's a very excellent kind of intervallic insertion that you offer us, and that also helps us with here, because Gedächtnis and Erinnerung struggle with that which can barely be remembered, maybe, on some, but which can't be forgotten. But what terms of forgetting, what terms of memory retrieval, how artificial, how authentic ever can memory be? These are questions in which we exist and tremble. And if one avoids or evades their complexity and goes for some easy cure or totalitarian is true, but totalizing system or closure or truth assertion, that's a way of blocking up the wounding incomprehensibility of that which attacks us every day. I mean, every day you have to ward off the shit. I don't know if you do it on what level of consciousness, right? But every day you have to get up and decide to put your traumas to bed so that you can move out and try to piece together. I'm not talking only autobiography here, I'm assuming, But this is a terrible tension of something that can't be wrapped up, or that always has a remnant, that always returns in some weird way, unrecognizably, unidentifiably. So as complex as Derrida's driving us toward the unintelligible is, that's also our only hope for the richness, encountering the richness of life. Because anything that diminishes all this difficulty and density and complexity, and where you want to bash your head against the wall because it's hardly making sense, that's life. There's nothing more real than that. Anything else is religion or belief or something that closes off the excess of meaning or lack of meaning. And
Or
I
what
think,
we call history even.
right, right. And I think that's a wonderful way for us to be talking together around this text, which is to say that we every day butt up against that which is impossible to seize or understand. We might, as Nietzsche says, to return to the early part of the seminar today, we might often find ourselves rushing in emergency supplies of meaning to stop the bleeding and stop the eruptions. That's what Nietzsche says we do. In order to have meaning or find meaning, we just rush in. We call the ambulance and say, bring us the emergency supplies we need, or not an ambulance, whatever truck system or transit system or metaphor system is going to move in very quickly with its sirens and all that, a lot of noise, a lot of buzzing. Bring in meaning and stop this terrible wounding or bleeding. And that's what all systems or non-systems of meaning try to do, is to stop up that which just blows into the spaces and neighborhoods of unintelligibility, you know. And that's hard. Here we are at the very limits of thinking what is possible, and note how we've done it with a para-concept or signifier or word that we thought we all knew, right? Like forgiveness. So we didn't come in with some barely legible term and try to figure it out, but we started slow and easy with something that we all and each have a relation to, even if it's in the cheeky and cheesy precincts of love. So let's try to continue and move into maybe practice, though I might see if Larry wants to do some work with us on some of these concepts and stuff.